Today's Lunchtime Lecture Series speaker, if you've been around the museum the last few years, probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Shellie Dolan has been associated with us for quite a long time. As a graduate student in history at the University of Rochester in the 2010s, she began work on a brilliant dissertation that considered the life of Frances Seward and brought that story to life in a way that had not been done by generations of scholars and historians. And it is something that has driven her to us. She helped us with our interpretive plan that we have now. She completed a graduate level internship with us a few years ago, and when she finished her PhD, she joined our board of trustees. So she still is with our museum and still helping to guide our mission in making sure the important stories of Frances Seward and her sister Lazette remain deeply a part of what we attempt to do here today. We often talk about Frances Seward. You can't have a tour of the Seward House Museum or hardly a program about the Seward family without Frances being at the heart of the house. That is far less true of her sister Lazette, whose life has remained somewhat more shadowed for reasons that Shellie will get into. But that does not mean that it is not worthy of our attention and consideration and to be placed into conversation, as Frances often was with Lazette in correspondence and in person. So today we're here to learn about the other Miller girl who grew up right here at 33 South Street, and there's no better person to teach us about her than Dr. Shellie Dolan. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Always an honor to come back and visit, and I always feel like I have my work cut out for me because I know that we very often have long-time volunteers and workers from the house, so sometimes it's hard to do something you all don't already know. We'll see how I do today. So as some of you probably know, during my studies at the University of Rochester, I had the opportunity to work in the Seward Project, a digital humanities project where students and staff from rare books and special collections worked to select, digitize, and transcribe letters from the William Seward manuscript collection, with a really unique aspect of incorporating senior citizen volunteers to help us transcribe this really challenging handwriting, which is rapidly becoming the secret code of previous generations. So when the university received this vast collection of family and political papers from William Seward in 1951, it was when researchers would be most interested in the materials related to William Seward's political career. So those were separated and put on microfilm, if you remember that advanced technology of the time. And Seward's letters did, of course, attract a great deal of attention, and even his wife Frances's letters, frequently mentioned, quoted in biographies, memoirs created by the family, and cited by a number of historians interested in Seward's political career. And it was Frances's letters, of course, that captured my interest while working in the archive. With over 40 years of these beautifully, carefully composed letters describing some of the most formative times in American history, which tell the daily struggles with her health, a house full of hired help that wasn't always so helpful in her opinion, and raising her children and keeping connected with her husband and her sister Lazette, of course, through her letters. Sadly, this record came to be because they were separated frequently for long periods of time throughout their lives. But it has left us with thousands of letters documenting their lives, their relationships, and their attitudes, and the news and politics of the decades. And they do give us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Lazette, who, like most respectable women of her time, remained very private throughout her life. Lazette was one of the closest, dearest people in Frances's life, even when they were far apart. She was her steady guiding force through triumph and tragedy, and her intellectual partner in the burgeoning abolition and women's rights movements, writing her frequently to share her opinion about a book, an article, or a sermon. And she was eagerly awaiting her sister's reply for days or even weeks. She couldn't wait to see what Lizette's opinions were about the most recent news. Lazette appears to have been really influential to Frances, and by extension, her brother-in-law, William Seward, known of course as Henry, to the family. So it does make it all the more disappointing to find that despite this regular correspondence over so many years, the majority of Lizette's letters are missing from the William Seward manuscript collection. There are almost 90 in the transcribed collection through the Seward Project, but that's compared to over 1,400 that were written by Frances. But many of those were to Lazette, revealing at least one side of their ongoing conversation, but leaving Lazette's side unavailable to us a great deal of the time. It's entirely possible that most of Lazette's letters were burned off her death, which was often done to protect the writer's privacy. This does seem like a significant loss because the descriptions of Lazette from the people who knew her paint her as a really charismatic, independent, witty, and caring person with a really sharp intellect. She was a central part of this family, and she had been for all of Frances's life. Sisters are very often close, but in the 19th century, these relationships could be magnified in a way that it's a little harder for us to understand now. As 19th century men and women lived in separate worlds, termed separate spheres at the time. This concept had gained a lot of traction after the American Revolution as towns and cities grew, and families weren't always spending their days together at home on the farm, but men were often going somewhere else to work and to engage in politics. Women, at the same time, were increasingly relegated to the home and domestic matters, and they could be ridiculed as masculine if they tried to engage in political conversations, and they could really be viewed as somewhat scandalous if they worked outside of the home. The reality, of course, is that plenty of women still had to work outside of the home. But the concept of separate spheres still left most women in a social world that was largely separated from men. So as a result, these female relationships can become very intense, with really strong supportive connections. And sisters who grew up close in age, like Lazette and her sister Frances, experienced so many of the joys and trials of life together. We provided emotional support for one another, physical assistance during pregnancies, childbirth, illnesses, or injuries, and they were one another's support system from the earliest days, from the time that they were going to boarding schools, to their relationships, to the challenges of their married lives. And being separated for many years when one or both of their husbands elected to move their families away from Auburn was really heartbreaking for them. But it did result in these decades of correspondence that allow us to better understand their role in life. There are some limitations to the letters beyond the lack of so many of Lazette's. Lazette and Frances, like so many of us, probably presented themselves in the situations they wrote about as they wished to be seen, the way that people might now on social media. Letters are also often read aloud to the entire family or shared among friends, sort of a pre-television version of reality entertainment that kept a lot of correspondence well within the bounds of propriety. And we also only usually get the perspective of the letter writer, although sometimes the manuscript collection does have both sides. But at the same time, Frances and Lazette still wrote to each other more freely than they would have to other people. And if they did write anything truly scandalous, it would have almost certainly been burned. Occasionally, a letter with a request to burn it escaped the fire and made it into the archive, but those tend to be a little more tame, and we'll never know what didn't make it. But we do know that they wrote about their political perspectives, their opinions of the people around them, and the many intimate daily stories of their families, their health struggles, and their innermost feelings. It's how they kept their relationship alive when they were separated from each other. So while we don't have the majority of Lazette's letters, we do have some. We know a great deal from Frances's letters and the descriptions from others who knew Lazette. So I've tried to piece together these sources to allow us to at least imagine, based in fact, Lazette Worden, the other Miller girl, who was such an integral part of this house and the Miller and Seward families. Some of you probably already know Lazette was born to Elijah Miller, a 10-foot Miller, who married in 1800 when Elijah was 27 and Hannah was just 15 years old. Elijah was appointed to the New York State Supreme Court and became active in land purchases and sales in the area, building his wealth and standing. And Lazette was born in November 1803, although some later census records show some years shaved off of her reported age. It wasn't entirely uncommon at this time. And she was followed in 1805 by her sister Frances, and the family moved here to Auburn in 1808 when Elijah opened a law practice here. But Hannah was unable to withstand the brutal winters here, so she spent the winters of 1809 to 1811 in her father's home in Massachusetts with the girls. but where she unfortunately died of tuberculosis at only 26 years old. So this time, 7-year-old Lazette and 5-year-old Frances returned to Auburn to be raised by their father, their grandmother, and their Aunt Clarinda, or Aunt Clary. So around this time, Elijah moved himself, his sister, his mother, and his daughters into a beautiful 10-room home that he had built on 4 acres of property right here on South Street. Lazette was just 15 years old when she moved here. Judge Miller never remarried after the loss of his wife. He'd been raised a Quaker, and his mother exposed her granddaughters to Quaker influences too. And while many American Quakers earlier on, including Miller's parents, had helped people who were enslaved, they were among the earliest groups to begin manumitting enslaved people and promoting abolition. So this Quaker background really influenced Lazette, her sister, and many of their neighbors here in Auburn, helping to cultivate really strong anti-slavery activity in the area. But Lazette witnessed slavery here in Auburn for about 20 years before legal emancipation, which had been phased in, was completed in New York in 1827. But she did live on this regular route for freedom seekers among all of these neighbors who often helped them on their way. And it really shaped her lifelong dedication to abolition. Many formerly enslaved people helped to form free Black communities here in Auburn and nearby, and they also became part of this network providing havens for people on their way to freedom in either the northeastern U.S. or Canada. One conservative estimate was that about at least 500 freedom seekers came through Auburn between about 1830 and the Civil War. But the risks of helping them still kept most conductors from reporting their activities at this time. So we are in the dark, unfortunately, a lot of the time about the specifics. But we do know that Lazette and her family would help many families that were on their journey along the Underground Railroad, both here in Auburn and in Canandaigua, when she later moved there. And that led her to spend the last decades of her life in a home that she made for herself here and called Pisgah, after the biblical monument from which Moses viewed the promised land before he died. I'm not sure who originated this name for her house, but it's mentioned in a number of the family letters and in Frances Seward's diaries. So Frances and Lazette, as I mentioned, lived at the height of separate spheres ideology in America, this belief that men belonged in public spaces like business and politics, and that women belonged in the home as mothers and homemakers. It wasn't a cultural or lifestyle choice, but a social and religious norm that was enforced with sometimes terrible effects on women and children. Women had very few options to work outside the home, so they had little way to support themselves or their children if they were widowed, abandoned, or lived with men who were abusive, alcoholic, disabled, or in any way unable or unwilling to support their families. And a mother who was trying to leave a situation like this didn't have the right to take her children with her, as they and she were considered the husband's property. So neither women nor men had the right to divorce in New York State unless they had proof of adultery, no matter how dire their circumstances were. Can anyone guess when that changed in New York? It was 1967 before the law changed in New York, around the time of the second women's rights movement. So there was still a great deal of work to be done there. But as Lazette and her sister are growing up in Auburn, about 150 years before that change finally happened, they were learning that as women, they were expected to marry, and once they had, there would probably be no exit from that marriage until they or their husbands died. And they were expected not to question the legal and social systems that dictated this, because if they did, they could be mocked, threatened, and called masculine for stepping out of their proper sphere. The state of women's rights may not have laid as much on the girls' minds as the visible slavery that they saw did during their early years when they were playing or strolling through the gardens here at Seward House. But the issue would have really long, difficult implications for Lazette, and it would eventually affect her sister's political evolution. Let's get to know Lazette a little bit better before all of that. The Auburn that she grew up in was still this emerging frontier town, with occasional unexpected visits at houses from displaced Native Americans, local doctors who arrived on horseback with medicines they prepared themselves in their saddlebags, and stagecoaches with westward travelers stopping in regularly. The girls affectionately called each other Fanny and Zeddy for a while, and the Miller girls joined the other children in Auburn, roaming the countryside, picking fruits and nuts, sleigh rides, and of course, helping with chores and going to school. The Miller girls were intelligent, though, and their father made sure they received a good education that went far beyond the limited scope that was usually provided for girls at the time, even when it meant sending them away to academies away from Auburn and the expensive room and board on top of tuition. Certainly there was no public education for children at this time. But for girls and young women from prominent families, the expense of a decent education wasn't a barrier, but an investment for fathers who wanted their daughters to marry well. And Elijah Miller made this investment in his daughters. So by 1815, Frances and Lazette are attending Windsor Female Seminary in Windsor, Vermont. And this school provided a really progressive curriculum that exposed girls to moral philosophy, natural history, and geography. The girl's love of reading was really well documented, with Frances once writing Lazette lamenting another girl's poor education, saying, "Why, Lazette, when we were 11 years old, we used to read, and to say the least, comprehend the plot of every novel that fell in our way." Their education included at least some natural sciences, too. Lazette detailed this for her grandmother in a letter in 1815, writing, "I've begun to study botany, and I regret being so late in the season, as the flowers are all decaying, and we cannot examine their different parts as well as if they were in full bloom." There's no rule to look these up at this point. So the Miller girls later attended Troy Female Seminary, one of the first women's educational institutions in the United States, opened by Emma Willard in 1821. And this school's curriculum was very similar to men's colleges. Math, geography, science, foreign languages, Latin, history, philosophy, and literature, instead of ornamental needlework, which is what most of the other young ladies institutions are teaching at this time. So while Willard did advocate for teaching women many of the same subjects as men, she was a very strong proponent of women's education. She did promote her seminary as a way of preparing young women for their roles as mothers charged with educating their children, noting in one document that it must strike many as absurd to educate women, but she reassured her audience that women would still owe their obedience to their husbands as a result of their financial dependence on them. She was not wrong, actually. So Lazette was back in Auburn while Frances was still at Troy in 1822. And the sisters missed each other terribly, and they wrote to each other all the time at this point. And Lazette kept her sister apprised of all the news and gossip in Auburn, revealing the frustrations of suitors who were asking after Frances in her absence. And she gently teased her, "It really makes me provoked with you to think how much interest you excite in Auburn. If I should stay 4 years, there would not be half as many inquiries made about me as there has been respecting you in 2 weeks." So one of their neighbors in Auburn, a lady named Azuba Hunt, left this wonderful recollection that she presented here at the Seward House in the 1880s, I believe. She recalled the Miller girls as being young ladies who graduated from the Troy Seminary, elegant and high-bred in their general deportment, and their father had all of their father's pride in his charming daughters. So while this talk is about Lazette, her sister's marriage is an important part of her story, so check in on Frances for a minute. Frances met Henry Seward while accompanying his sister, Louisa Cornelia, her Troy classmate, to visit her family in Florida, New York in 1821, and this meeting had lifelong impact for Lazette, who brought her sister for details on potential romantic interests in 1822, writing her, "I understand there were a great many Troy gentlemen at Florida to see you. Won't you tell us who they were?" Once Henry had entered the picture, Lazette teased Frances a little and showed her approval, saying, "Why did not Henry accompany you to Troy? Are we to infer from this that he was so unaccustomed to using any politeness and was so much fatigued with what he extended to you in Florida that he was determined to give it up as a hard task? No, I cannot believe this, for to tell the truth, I'm a little prepossessed in his favor." And as many of you know, Frances and Henry married in 1824 when Frances was 19. And at this time, Lizette's 21, a single, independent, free-spirited young woman living in her father's house in Auburn. And once again, neighbor Zuba provides this lovely snapshot of Lazette. It hints a little bit at her lively spirit. She wrote, Miss Lazette Miller was a young lady of very independent character, possessing a manner decidedly pronounced. I recall seeing her at church one hot afternoon, remove her large leghorn flat, the latest novelty in millinery, from her head covered with dark, beautiful chestnut curls, and adjusting them with the same coolness as though she was standing in her own dressing room, despite the remonstrances of her very stately Aunt Clara. Then replaced her hat as if she had done nothing outre or indecorous. It was necessary to Lazette Miller, and it was done. But Lizette's independence would still be tested. In 1825, Lazette married Lazette Worden, president of the Auburn Manufacturing Company, a man her father did not approve of. So Lazette and Frances were both pregnant the next year in 1826. And Lazette gave birth to her only child in December, a girl she named Frances after her sister. And some years later, of course, Frances Seward will name Lizette's niece Frances as well. So it's a little complicated. Stay tuned. The sisters were both in Auburn at this time, so there are not letters between the two that might have recorded their shared experiences during their pregnancies. But given how close they were, it does seem safe to assume that they spent a great deal of time preparing for and discussing their upcoming deliveries later that year. Within a few years of this happy time, Henry Seward was elected to his first office in the New York State Senate, and Frances and their children would begin spending much more time together in Albany, beginning long separations of the two. And in 1835, Lazette and her family moved to Canandaigua when Alva opened a law firm there. So the sisters kept themselves and their children close during these years with these regular letters. And many of Lizette's that have survived are to her nephews and her niece, revealing a doting aunt who sent baked goods, sometimes with an apology for the sorry state she knew they would arrive here in after their long journey from Canandaigua. And Lazette was a beloved aunt to the Seward children, writing to them a lot when they were apart. Like most of the family, Lazette loved animals, and she had this collection of cats, dogs, and birds, and other animals. And she would write to the children over the years, sharing the antics of her many pets, along with other descriptions of events that she thought might be of interest to them. So she once wrote to little Willie Seward in 1845, I had just seen the circus pass. Among them, there were 6 little horses. 2 of them were not much larger than Carlo, one of Lizette's dogs. And then she described how Carlo sat with his paws on the window watching until the circus passed by. And she continued on with a lighthearted suggestion. I thought how nice it would be to have one for you to ride. It would not want a stable larger than the north room. Imagine, of course, Frances' room. Lazette wrote of her dog Willie again the next year in 1846, saying, Carlo is well and naughty as ever, and his hairs do not stay in any better than they used to, confirming that pet shedding was as bad in the 19th century as it is now. She also wrote of rescuing a robin who'd been caught by a boy who was going to sell it to a man who put it in a cage, until Lazette paid him to set it free instead, saying it would be good to cage the creature. And she'd ask after Willie's rabbits and chickens and what he fed them. She was that wonderful aunt who always had a little sweet or a small thoughtful gift, and she took the time to notice what each child was interested in and ask about it. The children would visit her in Canandaigua, and Lazette accompanied the family to Albany and Washington on numerous occasions over the years as well. She had a deep sense of humor and a quiet, cutting wit, and sometimes poked a little fun in letters, very private letters, at her neighbors or acquaintances or political figures. Once observing, Granger has just returned, and I should think, from what I can make of him as he walks along, he has lost none of the good opinion he had of himself before he went away. And she noted a scion of another political family saying, Montgomery, or Gully as they called him at home as a child, and which name from his personal appearance is quite applicable now, has left college, or rather is at home. while she loved her role as an aunt and cherished her daughter Frances, her role as a wife was far more difficult. The letters do reveal this long pattern of unhappiness, financial difficulties, and abuse in Lizette's marriage. Only a few years into the Worden marriage, Frances wrote to Henry, "I went up and stayed a couple of hours with Lazette. Found her rather despondent. Worden had been very cross and struck her while she was attempting to punish Frances, their daughter, for some misdemeanor." So, while physical abuse unfortunately was not uncommon, and it didn't carry the stigma that it eventually would develop by the 20th century, later 20th century, it was a stark reality for many wives and those around them. Also found it very painful to witness all the same. And there was unfortunately very little legal protection, except in the most extreme cases. It was just sort of assumed part of society for many people. So Frances warned her husband of another incident at Lizette's house when Alvin was enraged, and this one displayed all the powerlessness of a wife and mother. She described all the time he held Frances firmly in his arms while she was struggling and screaming to get to her mother, telling her all the time between his fits of raving and weep that her mother did not care anything about her. Alvin Worden kept his wife in the marriage by threatening her with the loss of their daughter, and his right to custody probably would have been maintained by the courts if Lazette left him. Frances wrote again to relay her sister's distress. She says it does seem impossible for her any longer to endure such treatment, that she would willingly cross the ocean, go into a strange land, and toil for subsistence if she could but take with her a child. And this wasn't necessarily a light mention of Lizette's willingness to go overseas. Frances was writing to her husband while he was in Europe, telling him that they left it to him what was to be done. It's at least possible that she hoped to elicit his approval and maybe even support for her sister to flee the country with her child, but in a manner that left it to his discretion. She wrote him, "Many frame laws, I believe, to uphold themselves in their wickedness. What right can a father have in peaceable separation to take the children? Did they endure any of the agony of a mother in bringing them into existence? Can they feel that tenderness which is so innately woven into every fiber of the mother's heart? I believe he's made up his mind that he will no longer maintain Lazette." Her mention of the legal limitations her sister faced and the lack of support from Auburn Worden may have been intended to remind Henry that there were few options for abused wives, and it was fairly rare because it's career law, but if so, if it was an attempt to extricate Lazette and her daughter, it failed, and Lazette did remain in the marriage, he would be powerless to change her situation. In another letter, Frances had written, "I do think Worden is the most absurd, inconsistent, tyrannical, unfeeling monster I ever met, and if there is anybody I do hate." Frances' letters, she could be sharply critical of some people in situations, but she rarely used language that strong or displayed such open loathing, really, as she did for her sister's husband. Alpha had consistent difficulties supporting the family, and Frances was also made aware by this of the dangers of women's lack of property rights in an 1831 letter when she wrote, "I do hope Pa will never let this house go into the hands of Alvin Worden. He would most assuredly mortgage or sell it before the expiration of 1 year. If Worden cannot provide food for his family, I think he must indeed be past all hope." Until the Married Women's Property Act passed in New York State in 1848, husbands assumed control of all their wife's property. And it was situations like Lizette's that did finally gain documented support for the act to pass, if only to help keep irresponsible sons-in-law from draining family assets more than to advance women's rights. William Seward helped secure jobs for Alvin Worden. Worden occasionally lashed out angrily at Seward in letters as well, and the Seward family had less contact with him once he moved to Canandaigua. Lazette wrote her nephew Gus once in 1846 when she and her daughter missed an opportunity to visit with him. "You speak of your disappointment in not seeing Frances and myself at West Point this summer. It certainly could not be greater than ours. But your uncle has wasted so much of his time these past 2 years, and but he thought he could not afford to have us long journeys. Her bitterness was palpable, but she had no recourse. Once, after finding her sister sick in a leak in the house that Alvin would not fix, Frances wrote, "My poor sis, hers is a rough path through this world." Beyond turning to Henry for assistance, sometimes finding her husband work, Lazette also sometimes consulted with him instead of Alva about their finances. Once writing him, "The bank account you send corresponds in every particular with the one I've kept. I have been very sorry to present an overdrawn account, but it was unavoidable, and I'm glad it does not appear to you as of much consequence as I had considered it. But as a woman that could do nothing to change their financial circumstances." It also appears that Alva tried to keep Lazette from visiting her sister Frances at times, including when Frances was pregnant in 1844 with her daughter Fanny. Yes, here's Frances number 3, the immediate family. During a visit, though, Frances Seward's niece, Frances Worden, revealed that Alva had prevented Lazette from going to stay with her at this time. She wrote her mother, "I had laid this beef flayed and hung over the temples to leave here. Auntie would be so lonesome. I just like to leave her. I will intercede with Pa and have him come out here and sing, for it seems too bad to have her stay here all alone." The Worden marriage, like so many others during this time, is held together by the bonds of law and society long after the bonds of admiration and attraction have been broken. After 2 decades of marriage, Lazette wrote her nephew Gus, "It is Frances' 20th birthday, and the recollection of the many changes and chances which have befallen me in that time makes me sad. Fan says she dislikes to have her birthday come around because I make so many lamentations over the years past." Lazette Noel's letters reveal little affection during their marriage, but they did appear to find some peace in the final hours of his life. Frances relayed Worden's last words, saying, "All day yesterday," Lazette said, "I sat by his bedside with his hand clasped in mine. He knows now how much and how faithfully I tried to please him, even though I failed to succeed." Lazette returned to Auburn after Alva's death in 1856. She wrote, "I'm very delightfully situated, with my family connections and kind friends all about me. When I look back upon my life in Canandaigua as 19 years of discipline, which, though perhaps necessary, is not pleasant to remember." And in moving back to Auburn, Lazette was separated from her beloved daughter and his disappointed grandson, Frank. But it seems the memories of her difficult life in Canandaigua might have made it too painful for her to stay there, and she missed her sister and her social circle in Auburn too much to remain away any longer. She did support this burgeoning women's rights movement. She didn't hesitate to share her opinion with her sister or even Henry in private, writing Henry in 1853 to express her disgust with his political advisor and longtime family friend, Thurlow Lee. She wrote, "I see by today's paper that your Uncle Lee has defined his position in regard to women's rights, which is against them, and himself, according to my view. We need to oppose bills publicly for women's rights to divorce drunkards or those whose neglect or irresponsibility put them or their children at risk." Probably painfully familiar to Lazette. But we prioritize politics over reform. Supporting women's rights was a greater political risk than even abolition, which we did support. Abolition would have far less immediate impact on northern men's daily lives than women's rights would. And while there were many men who aided the campaign for women, none could expect to achieve the high offices that Lee coveted for his protégés. And Lazette was disgusted by his stance, though, in spite of Henry's position as one of those protégés, and in spite of Lee's close relationship with the family. At this time, though, the conversations that Lazette is having with her sister Frances help them both examine the fluid evolutionary ideas and criticisms that surrounded the women's rights movement. And to the fairly traditional Frances, her sister's influence was probably very emboldening. Lazette was still an independent, strong-minded woman despite her difficult marriage. Frances didn't share Lazette's independent spirit or easy charisma, something she was painfully aware of. and which sometimes frustrated their more radical neighbor, women's rights activist Martha Coffin Wright. So Frances once wrote her sister in 1852 saying, "Mrs. Wright was here. I believe she came to lecture me for want of boldness," of which she certainly presents a striking example. But she was disappointed not to have seen me. So, well, Lazette had few rights as a married woman, but after the death of her husband and her return to Auburn, she did enjoy her right to own property with a parcel of land left to her by her father. She rejoiced in having her own home built, writing to a friend, "I am building this summer, dear Sarah, building a house to live in. Now, don't imagine me sailing about with calfskin boots not laced up, without stockings, and with little, if any, other clothing, sleeping on the floor and cooking in the middle of the dooryard. For I try to appear as much like a person living in a Christian community as if I were not having a house made of brick and stone." But despite her joy in dancing barefoot on Archival through her new kitchen, Lazette now had the bitterness of paying taxes on her property without having political representation. So it was evident she hired men to work for her who would vote in her stead. Henry Seward quoted his sister-in-law as saying, "I am responsible for my own taxes. I am amenable to all the laws of the state. I must pay the penalty of my own crimes if I commit any. Hence, I have the right, according to the principles of our government, to representation. And so long as I am not allowed to vote in person, I have the right to do so by proxy. Hence, I hire men to vote my principles," noting that she had no father, husband, or son to represent her. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also related the story about Lazette in the book later, noting that Henry Seward asked Lazette one day, "Are you sure your men vote as they promise?" And she said, "Yes. I trust nothing to their discretion. I take them in my carriage within sight of the polls and put them in the charge of some Republican who trust him. I see that they have the right to live, and then I feel sure that I'm faithfully represented. And I know I'm right in doing so." Lazette was often dependent on Henry's generosity, and she was acutely aware of her sister's best interests too. So she, like Frances, was very restrained in public activism by Henry's high-profile political career. But many of her letters over the decades that might have shed more light on a lot of her attitudes and her actions to help promote the reform movements that she believed in are missing from our collections. So we simply know from Frances' side that her interest in women's rights absolutely bolstered Frances's. And her feisty spirit probably inspired her sister to push through some of her discomfort. She started to reconsider some of her own attitudes on women's proper place. Right, so we mentioned a little earlier how the Miller girls grew up in this area with very deep abolitionist sentiments. Although there was still rampant racism, and it was incredibly dangerous to assist fugitives seeking freedom, even here in Central and Western New York. But this did not stop the conductors from helping people along to the next stop. While William Seward and his wife did not write much about their work assisting fugitives, Lazette's daughter Frances did later write her recollections of the family's involvement with the Underground Railroad. And in this recollection, as she describes her father Alva, you can see a little bit of another side of him too, maybe a little bit of the man that Lazette had fallen in love with so many years before. She wrote, "My father, though a law-abiding citizen and not an abolitionist, was a just man and one that feared God." She described how he was moved to vote in support of black men's rights to vote in New York State when the New York State legislature introduced a motion in 1841, as well as his support to annul a law that had allowed Southern men to travel into New York State with enslaved people and keep them as slaves while they were here. So Frances wrote of her father, "Whether it was in anticipation of this last clause becoming a law, or his own kindness of heart that induced him the following winter to cooperate with my mother in assisting a fugitive slave harbored by the Valentines, I cannot say. I do know that he gave most substantial aid and comfort to the poor creature, and by his advice secured freedom. It was a bitter cold morning when Richard Valentine appeared in our kitchen, asking for everything considered necessary to the comfort of the fugitive and her two children." My father, mother, our faithful Elsie, and I eagerly listening. Elsie from the kitchen stores soon supplied sufficient to satisfy the hunger of a trio that seemed to have dropped from the clouds in the night. And during the day, my mother shaped out innumerable garments. And though I was but a child, I was kept sewing far into the night to furnish warm clothing for this family. Before spring, I heard Richard tell my father the woman had heard her master was in pursuit, and the order was given to procure conveyance and take the family to Farmington, a Quaker settlement north of us, on the direct road of the Underground Railroad into Canada. By the time the master reached Canandaigua, the good Quakers had his prey safe over the line. As the nation entered into the Civil War, Lazette continued to support abolition in various ways. There is oral history that suggests that Frances Seward fostered Harriet Tubman's niece, Margaret Stewart, while Tubman served in the Union Army. But their neighbor, Martha Coffin Wright, mentioned in an 1862 letter, Mrs. Worden was taken at contraband, 10 years old, a niece of Harriet Tubman. Placing this relative of Tubman in Auburn and within the Seward family circle, but with Lazette. It does seem most likely that both Lazette and Margaret probably stayed with Frances here on South Street for a time. It wasn't uncommon for Lazette to stay with her sister in the family home over the years, or for Frances to take in a child in need. So there's probably truth to both sides of those perspectives. So at this time, many members of the women's rights movement, which also very often had overlapping members in the abolition movement, shifted their focus entirely to support abolition in the Union Army. So Lazette presided over Auburn's Good Samaritan Society during the Civil War, while her sister supported the Ladies' Union Society behind the scenes, would take the presidency a little too public for Frances. The two societies together provided blankets, food, medicine, shirts, undergarments, linens, bandages, and more until the end of the war. Lazette joined the Sewards in Washington many times during their stays there at this time as well, writing a friend of some of her impressions of the war in 1863. I was in Washington 3 weeks and spent all of the time I was well enough to go out and visiting hospitals and seeing everything I could in connection with the war. Of course, I also saw too much pain, for war, as Whitman says, wounds us all a little. But I was more encouraged by the patriotism, self-denial, and the earnestness of the few than I was discouraged by the selfishness, cruelty, and dishonesty of the many. For who has ever seen a cause with all the adherents, or even the majority of them, good and pure? She also pushed back on some common misconceptions at the time about people who thought that free people, once emancipated, could become a burden on society. And she wrote, "I wish those people who think they cannot take care of themselves would read the reports that I do. Of General Saxton and General Higginson's testimony, of their bravery, fidelity, and temperance as soldiers. Of Mrs. Gage, who is at Beaufort teaching them, who says they are in every respect more honest, intelligent, and religious than the same class of whites. Of Burnside and Mitchell, who have both said that they held all of the coast of South Carolina, which we took, entirely through the vigilance and the bravery of the blacks. And lastly, the report of the Secretary of the Treasury, who informs us they have a surplus fund of $500,000 of their own earnings, often deducting their support and the support of many lazy whites therefrom. But such persons read nothing and will not hear what others say who are informed." In 1865, April, just days after the surrender of the Confederate Army at Appomattox, Lazette's brother-in-law Henry and two of her nephews were seriously injured in an attack. It was part of the assassination conspiracy that ended up killing President Abraham Lincoln. So while Henry and Lazette's nephew Fred had a very long road to recovery, it did begin to improve as the summer wore on. But then on June 20th, Henry sent a dire telegram to Auburn to Lazette, saying, "Frances' condition was critical. Come on, but not to the state of your own health permits." But there was no time for goodbyes. Lazette received a telegram from Henry via the Department of State next morning, simply saying, "Mother died 10:15 this morning." Frances, like Lizette's lifelong companion, her dearest sister, died in Washington, possibly from complications of her long illnesses and strained attack on her husband and sons. We don't need to have her letters at this time to understand how heartbroken she must have been. She channeled her grief into caring for her sister's namesake daughter, Frances Seward, who likely had tuberculosis, which killed at least 1 in 7 people in the U.S. and in Europe in the 19th century. Lazette watched over Fanny in Auburn as she suffered from fever just weeks after her mother's death, writing to update the still grieving Henry on July 4th that his daughter was improved, but her fever continued to return in the coming days and months. And Fanny would die from her illness in October of the next year at the age of 21. Just before Fanny's death, though, Lazette continued to spend time in Washington with the family, occupying some of the void left by Frances's death. In 1866, she wrote her nephew Willie's wife with dry observations in Washington's hairstyle trends, saying, "At the last drawing room at the White House, many young ladies wore their hair hanging on their necks, without curls or combs. So you are in full dress as far as your hair is concerned when you first rise in the morning. It must be a convenient fashion." She would continue to share hot gossip from their social and political circles with the Seward children, and probably with her daughter, but those letters are mostly not recollection. All of this during the remainder of Henry's time in office. Once writing her nephew Gus, "I must now tell you a pretty piece of gossip I heard last night, which amused me very much." Maybe in part because it gave her a chance to throw some shade at her sister's nemesis, Mary Todd Lincoln, who had snubbed Frances and Fanny Seward, refusing to see them after she invited them to call at the White House. So Lazette told Gus about his little pre-Downton Abbey, this young American girl who married a German duke more than 3 times her age, a marriage of her money and his nobility, but that also left her widowed very early on. So she returned to live with her mother, but a few years later, Lazette wrote, Madame received an order from the Duke of Holstein to return to him the court jewels, which, after the manner of Mrs. Lincoln, she had appropriated. I don't know what became of the lady or the Duke's family jewels, but Mary Lincoln's lavish spending, river-like fingers, and challenging personality made her a figure of interest to many. And Lazette wrote of the consequences of that interest a few years later in 1868, saying, Elizabeth Keckley, Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, has published a book entitled Behind the Scenes. I should like to see it. Anna says she can send for it. Well, Keckley had intended a bit to present Mary Lincoln in a more sympathetic light. Mary herself and many others felt it was a heinous invasion of privacy, especially for a 19th century woman. It would be really interesting to know what Lazette had thought of the book once she read it, but I would guess a mixture of interest in the foibles of her sister's antagonist, mingled with horror in another woman's life, and what she knew personally being someone who was in print. Lazette spent some of her remaining years living with a friend and neighbor, Eliza, here in Auburn, and maintaining regular contact with the family and still spending lots of time here with the family at South Street. She died on October 3rd, 1875, and was, of course, buried right by her sister over in Fort Hill Cemetery. So respectable 19th century women were said to only have their names in print twice, when they married and when they died. So whatever activities they were engaged in, Lazette, her sister, and many other women at this time remained very intentionally hidden from public view. So while Lazette has remained an even more shadowy figure than her sister Frances, her name was recognized among many circles. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote of her, "These 2 sisters, Mrs. Worden and Mrs. Seward, daughters of Judge Miller, were women of culture and remarkable natural intelligence, and interested in all progressive ideas. They had rare common sense and independence of character, great simplicity of manner, and were wholly indifferent to the low arts of the toilet." Lazette was also remembered among members of the Underground Railroad. Her daughter Frances recalled one man who settled in Canandaigua after the Civil War, Lawrence Thornton, who was one of Harriet Tubman's passengers on the Underground Railroad. Lawrence had served as a soldier after emancipation and earned a living and a reputation as a hard worker and an honest man who provided cleaning services and handyman services around town. So Frances Worden, now Worden Chesborough, wrote, It was when washing windows for me one day that he made the discovery that I originally came from Auburn, that I knew Harriet Tubman, and that Mrs. Worden was my mother. Dropping his cleaning utensils, he turned face about so suddenly that I startled back, and he exclaimed, "You're Mrs. Worden's daughter and living in this little house?" Oh my. Then he resumed his work in his usual dignified silence. Lazette Worden was a 19th century daughter, sister, wife, and mother who understood firsthand the limitations of the law and women's rights, but spent so many years working quietly behind the scenes to improve the world around her, just as countless other women did, finding ways to call attention to the issues, if not themselves. She had often immediate impact on the people that she helped. The kind that often doesn't make it into the newspapers and history books, made all the difference to them. And through it all, near or far, Lazette was an essential part of this home and the family who lived here, as well as the Auburn community. Thanks so much for taking the time to get to know her.